His name is Red Roberts. I anticipate we'll hear from Mr. Roberts. She then goes to a barbecue at Troy Davis's home. Now, Troy Davis, as some of you may know, was the former superintendent at that time. He was working down in Lowndes County, but they still lived here. Because of her job with the school, she had gotten to know Mr. Davis. Thank you. Best laid plans, right? We tested this on Friday. You'll hear that she's at the barbecue for some time. This is the picture that you'll see of Miss Grinstead. Again, I believe the last picture that's taken of her. This is also, you'll see, from the pageant itself. Now, you'll hear that she goes to this barbecue at Mr. Davis' house. His wife is there, some other friends are there, and she stays until sometime in the afternoon. This was the day, October, South Georgia folks were watching the Georgia game. So some of them had very particular memories about times, and you'll hear from them. You'll hear that when she leaves, and Mr. Davis walks her out to her car, tells her goodbye. To our knowledge, he is the last person to see her alive other than Ryan Duke. She goes home. No one hears from her again. You'll hear on October 23rd, 2005, which is the day after the sweet potato pageant, no one can find her. Now these are records of some phones the caller ID that you'll hear about. You've heard us ask some questions about when we used to have home phones. She had a home phone. And when they arrived and checked her caller ID, what they learned was that people were desperate to find her. You'll see that among other things, Heath Dykes calls her at 8:23, at 9:45, at just after midnight at 12:33, he calls her 3 different times. But he's not the only one who's desperate to find her. Her mother, Faye Grinstead, Miss Faye has now passed away. But at the time, she and Mr. Dykes had been communicating, and neither one of them could find Tara. Miss Faye is calling. Well, these aren't the only phone calls you'll see, but these are the people who we know were trying desperately to find Tara. Because at this point, by the time that Mr. Dykes is calling her at 12:30 in the morning, she's not been heard from for over 24 hours. Now you'll hear that Mr. Dykes and Tara Grinstead had a romantic relationship. You'll also hear that he was married. At the time, and still does, he worked for the city of Perry. He had known Tara Grinstead before he was married. They grew up in the same area. And they, at some point, had started a romantic relationship. And Mr. Dykes, when he testifies, will talk to you about that. He actually drove to her residence. Those phone calls that you see that are back to back to back. He's outside. He'll tell you he's outside knocking on her window. Because at this point, they've become so desperate, no one's heard from her for 24 hours. And they're not just calling this phone, they're calling her cell phone too. You even get to hear the recording from her answering machine, in which Mr. Dykes goes from upset that she's not calling him back to desperate. Her mother is calling and leaving messages because no one can find her. And then you'll hear about the morning of October 24th. This was a Monday morning. And on October 24th, Tara didn't show up for work. She didn't call in. She didn't show up. And so now we not only have Heath Dykes and her mother trying to find her, but we also have Joe Portier, her neighbor. Actually, I believe Mr. Portier calls her twice that morning. Because at this point, she failed to show Dina Causey. Miss Causey at the time was married to the father of Tara's old boyfriend. Everyone's heard about the relationship that she had with Marcus Harper, and you'll hear about that throughout the trial. Dina was Marcus's stepmother. Marcus's father has now passed away, and Miss Dina has remarried. But they all go over. So Joe Portier, Dina Harper, these various people who are friends of hers show up at her house to see if they can find her. Because now, again, they realize no one's heard from her in over 24 hours. Joe Portier and his wife, Myrtle, had a key to her residence. They're neighbors, they're friendly. At this point, Tara is living alone in Ocilla. You'll hear evidence that the reason she ended up here was that her father and stepmother were living here for a time period, and she did her student teaching here. And she loved it, and she stayed. When they had to move away from Mr. Grinstead's work, she stayed and got her own place. And that's how she ended up living alone. This is a woman who's under the age of 30, living alone in a residence, no family in the community, and the neighbors essentially adopted her. Both of them. Now, you won't hear from Miss Myrtle. She unfortunately has suffered some medical issues and is currently in a nursing home. She's alive, but she's not in a position that she can testify. But you will hear from Mr. Portier. And you'll hear about how they go into the house to see if maybe Tara's in there. And what they find is that her cell phone's still there, and there's no sign of her. They can't find a purse. But I anticipate the evidence will show she can go anywhere. Even back in 2005, she can go anywhere without her cell phone. So they call law enforcement. You'll hear from several of the officers who are the first to arrive. First being Chief Billy himself. Chief Hancock arrives and realizes this is actually going to be something they need to look into, he calls the then lead investigator, Bill Bars. And Bill Bars is the one who collects this glove. You'll hear from him. He still works at the Sheriff's Department. He's an SRA now. He collects this glove, and it later gets turned over to the GBI. This will wind up being one of the key pieces of evidence that you hear. They also later discover that the comforter on her bed has blood. Now, I don't anticipate you will hear anyone tell you whether or not this is blood from a wound or menstrual blood. But it's a clue. It's something that they had that they need to look at. Because the issue they had going into this case is, as you saw in some of the pictures, and you'll see throughout the course of this trial, her bedroom was a mess. But she had teenage girls and younger girls in and out of her room all day, trying on her jewelry, using her makeup, trying on her own dresses. So law enforcement is left to determine, look, has there been a struggle? Has someone rifled in her face? Or is this just a bunch of girls getting ready for a pageant, leaving a mess behind? So they have to try and put these clues together. One of the clues that you'll hear about comes from her caller ID. Now you've already heard me talk about it. You'll hear about a caller ID from the 23rd and the 24th. This is a picture of her phone, as it was on the morning of 24th. You'll hear that when Bill Bars arrives, the phone portion of the handset is actually on the floor in the bathroom. He picks it up to try to call someone to see if they know where she is. And then he places it back on the handset. So this picture is taken by the GBI after it's been placed back on the handset. You'll see other pictures of it on the floor in the background that Bill Bars took. But there's caller ID that's built into that handset. And one of the things that GBI agents do when they get there is to check the caller ID. And one particular call stands out. It's a call that reads North Coast Pay. That's not something that we normally would think of. It wasn't a person. It wasn't Keith Dykes. It wasn't Bay Grinstead. North Coast Pay. And the agents had a belief at that point that this would be from a payphone. Through their investigation, I anticipate you'll see they were right. Came from a payphone right around the corner here. It's now G&G. I think it was the Swifty Mark back in 2005. And so, among the other things, they start tracking down phone records. They track down Tara's phone records, Keith Dyke's phone records, Marcus's phone records, and they track down the records of North Coast Pay. And what they find in North Coast Pay is that at a time that matches her caller ID, there's a call made to 411. Now, those call records, there's actually two numbers. There's an 800 number, and there's 229-555-1212. Now, for those who don't remember a time before 411, which is most probably everybody in the jury, I anticipate you'll hear that that's the number you call for directory assistance before we had 411 as the shortcut. So now, the agents know, in the course of this investigation, they're learning that someone has called her the morning of October 23rd, someone who had to use 411 to get her number, and they called from the payphone just right around the corner. That is also going to be a pivotal piece of evidence in this case. You'll hear from law enforcement who will talk about what they refer to as guilty knowledge. And I anticipate what they'll tell you is guilty knowledge is something that law enforcement specifically holds back from the public. They keep that close to their chest. Because generally, only one person is going to know about that guilty knowledge. And that's the person Another piece of guilty knowledge that is kept back, and you'll hear about this, is that that glove didn't just have the DNA of one person, but it had two. What they do is they submit all the evidence they can to the crime lab. One of them being the company. I've already told you this, but they actually scientifically tested it. It was in fact Tara's DNA, and you'll hear that. And you'll see this glove. And I'll tell you, back in 2005, you'll hear that the crime lab came up with a pretty impressive way of handling this. You'll hear testimony that generally, on a piece of evidence, you have to choose. You can either try and get prints, or you can try and get what we refer to as touch DNA. Touch DNA is not, you don't usually have as many cells, for instance, is what they'll tell you, the scientists will tell you, as you do with bodily fluids, semen, saliva, those sorts of things. Touch DNA is exactly what it sounds like. If I touch something and I create enough friction, my DNA can get left behind. And in 2005, touch DNA was something that the crime lab in Georgia was familiar with, but their science at the time was not sensitive enough to always see touch DNA. Obviously, things have progressed since then. But they devised this plan. They'll tell you about it. You'll hear from a gentleman specifically named Larry Peterson, who no longer employed the GBI, but he was there for years. And he'll tell you they come up with this plan, he and agents from the GBI, and what they decide to do is they're going to try and do both. They're going to try and get prints and get DNA. So they take this glove. Now you'll notice the glove appears to have been worn. They take it and they turn it the right side out, and they cut it into pieces. And what they do is the portions that they believe they're most likely to find prints, those go to the latent print examiners. That means the finger and the palm. And the portion across the middle of the hand gets sent to DNA. Now again, in 2005, you'll hear this was pretty novel. That's what they did. You'll hear that they were not, they weren't very positive about the idea of finding DNA that they were going to try. And as it turns out, they were successful. You'll hear from the original latent print examiner, the glove is now pink, you'll hear that that's because of chemicals they have to apply. Latent prints, and they'll describe to you, are ones that are not visible to the naked eye. So they have to try and use a chemical to lift those so you can see them. They'll explain it much better than I do, they're scientists. But that's why the glove is now pink. And you'll hear him talk about that back then, in 2005, he identified one print that he believed was suitable for comparison. That's the words they use. We don't have anybody to compare it yet to, but when we find somebody, when we find a suspect, we think that this print is good enough to compare. They also send it to DNA. And what they find out, as I've already told you, there were two DNAs on this glove. First is tara-grinstead. The second is an unknown male. And for decades, that's all we know. From October of 2005 until February 22nd of 2017, tara-grinstead is officially listed as a missing person. I anticipate you'll hear that at some point her parents or family may have had to declare dead, but the GBI's case was for a missing person. But on February 22nd, 2017, everything changed. Just occurred to me, I think this is on silent. Judge, am I good to continue with that noise, or?
What's going on?
This is, Judge, this is unfortunately
continue, may we pray for just a moment?
Sure.
Thank you.
Everything changes in this case. Because you'll hear that on that day, Ryan did confess to GBI agents that he murdered tara-grinstead. I think our system must be turned off, Judge. So I'll keep going. You'll hear Ryan Duke, in his own words, describe how he broke into her residence. In his words, he was going through her purse, and she surprised him. So he just reacted and turned around and hit her. She died. And I'll tell you, his response was to run. He later comes back. That's where that phone call comes in. He admits he's the one that made that phone call. He calls the house to see if anyone's there before he comes back. And again, something's wrong with the audio this morning with a bunch of stuff. But you'll be able not only to hear him say that, but to watch him in his own words. He'll tell law enforcement how this has been weighing on him, that he knows he should have come forward. He knows he should have done his best to give answers to this family. You'll have a chance to see him and make your own decision about this statement. You'll hear from him out of his own words, confessing to her murder. You'll see him on video confessing to her murder. And you'll see it in his own handwriting, confessing to her murder. Words are useless, but I am burdened with the guilt of murdering Miss Grinstead. I don't feel like I deserve to be free to breathe. I can't begin to comprehend the pain I have caused to her family and loved ones. I don't feel like I need to live with the pain I have caused. And he goes on. You'll have a chance to see that document that he wrote. Again, confessing to the murder of tara-grinstead. He confesses that he's the one that brought the glove. The glove you'll hear about that has DNA, tara-grinstead's DNA. He says that when he left her, when he ran, after she's on the ground, that he goes home and he gets the gloves. He keeps them at his residence for when he changes his kitty litter. And he brings the gloves with him, along with a blanket. And he carries her out of her residence and puts her in the truck. Now what you'll hear is that that truck belonged to his best friend, Bo Dukes. At the time, he and Bo were living together. Bo was staying at the house with Ryan and Ryan's brother, Stephen Duke. Ryan, in his interview, actually says he stole the vehicle. He took the keys out of Bo's pocket. I anticipate the evidence will show that he used that vehicle on a regular basis. So he takes her body, wrapped in a blanket, and carries her to the truck. And on the way, he drops the glove. He admits to being the one who made the phone call. He even knows that it's a 411 call. When they ask him, tell us about the phone call. How did that happen? How did you have her number? I dialed 411. Now remember, the evidence will show that had been kept secret for years. But he knew about it. And he admits to being the one to making that phone call. He then directs them to the place where he says he dumps her body. He confesses to taking her, putting her in this truck, and driving her to a location in Ben Hill County, which is known as Fitzgerald Farms. You'll hear from Randy Hudson, who is the current owner of that property. I believe back in 2005 he didn't own the property, he leased it, but his farm was run there. Now I say near the orchard because the evidence will show that initially Ryan dumps her sort of right off the back of the orchard and leaves her there. You'll hear him while they're riding down there giving law enforcement directions to the location. And then when they ride past the area, he'll say, that's around the place where I dumped her body before we got her and cremated her. It's the words that he uses for what they did to her body. Cremated her. And you'll hear him confess that he later goes back and gets his friend, Bo Dukes. You will hear him repeatedly during his confession say that Bo Dukes was never at tara-Grinstead's house. But what happened was after he had dumped her on essentially Bo's family's land. He was familiar with it because he and Bo were best friends and they went and had bonfires out there all the time. And at some point after that, he goes and he gets Bo. And initially, I think he'll tell you, you'll hear in his confession, that Bo didn't really believe him. But finally, he and Bo drive out there. He takes Bo to where her body is. And he'll tell you that Bo and he then take her body and move it to another location in the pines. You'll see a video of him showing law enforcement trying to locate the place where they, in his words, cremated her. It's changed since then. But he's out there. Incidentally, he's handcuffed, smoking a cigarette, walking around in the woods just fine, trying to show them where he cremated, he and Bo. As a result of his statement to law enforcement, they're able to speak with Randy Hudson, and Randy Hudson will tell you that he remembered a time back in 2005 where he was very angry with his nephew, Bo Dukes. Now again, Randy Hudson didn't own the property at the time, but it was his farm, it was his pecan trees. But they didn't burn her in the pecan orchard, they burned her out in the woods near a bunch of pine trees. Now we all know the dangers of doing that in South Georgia. And so when Randy sees that they've been burning something, now obviously he'll tell you he did not know it was a body. He thought they had had one of their bonfires and had just moved it further into the woods. He jumps all over Bo. He fusses at him for having a bonfire in the middle of the woods where it could have caught fire. He fusses at them for taking the pecan wood to make the fire. He'll tell you the pecan wood didn't even belong to his family. It actually belonged to the widow of the gentleman who had owned that property. It was her pecan wood. And he was mad as fire that Bo had gone and taken her pecan wood. And so Randy had a specific memory of that incident. And you'll hear that when law enforcement speak to him about this, he knows exactly where that fire pit was. And he gets them to within, I'm terrible with distances, but I'd say about 10 feet. And they start to dig. And you'll hear about how they came up with this plan, a grid, to continue to dig. Layer by layer, they sifted through the dirt. And as they sifted, if they came up with something that they believed could be bone, it was given to this lady right here, Dr. Alice Gooding. She is a forensic anthropologist, which means that this is what she does for a living. She takes the bones of humans and can identify not just that they're human, but generally what portion of the body they're from. GBI employed her in this case, and you'll get to hear from her. And through that dig, Tara is finally found, piece by piece by piece. Her backbone, her teeth, her fingers, her toes. That's what was left of Tara Grinstead after Bo Dukes and Ryan Duke cremated her. And you'll hear Ryan confess to this. You'll hear from Dr. Alice Gooding, and I anticipate what she'll tell you is that each of the bones that was identified in this case, she can tell you a few things about them. One, they identify human bones. There are some animal bones found. She can separate those out. She identifies human bones. She can tell you they're from an adult. She can tell you they're all from the same adult. And she can tell you that they've been burned. These are the bones that are found where the defendant said, I burned Tara Grinstead's body after I murdered her. But what about the glove we've talked about? I told you earlier, we knew back in 2005 that Tara Grinstead's DNA was on it, as well as an unknown male. Well, in 2017, when Ryan Duke confesses, law enforcement also gets a sample of his DNA. This is the first time he was ever swabbed in this case. And lo and behold, it's his. During the interview, Agent Shadell will ask him, you'll hear it. Now, the DNA on the glove, is that going to be yours? And he says, yes. It should be. And it is. Now, there's a lot more details to this glove. There's DNA on the outside. There's DNA on the inside. They re-swab it in 2015. But the bottom line with the glove is the primary contributor to the glove of DNA is Ryan Duke. And we've had his DNA since 2005. We just didn't know whose it was. And you'll hear in this courtroom we do now know. He also confesses, not just with his DNA, not just with his words, not just with his writing, but with his prints. You'll hear that on the glove, in 2017, after he confesses, they look at the glove, the prints. That particular analyst will tell you that in 2017, she's actually able to identify what she refers to as 3 suitable for comparison prints. But they're actually palm prints, they're not fingerprints. I anticipate you'll hear from the gentleman who only identified 1 print. And I anticipate what he'll tell you is that he was very young and inexperienced in 2005. That he would have erred on the side of caution. But in 2017, when you hear from Jessie Worley, who is an extremely experienced latent print examiner, she identifies 3 prints. And when she compares them to those of Ryan Duke, they match. He confesses with his words. He confesses with his writings. He confesses with his actions by walking them out there and showing them the location. He confesses with his knowledge, the phone call. And he confesses with his DNA and his prints. Over and over and over again during this interview, Ryan Duke admits that he murdered Tara Grinstead in the early morning hours of October 23rd, 2005. Throughout the course of this trial, you'll get to hear from a number of witnesses. And what you'll hear will come down to this. Ryan Duke confessed. And at the end of the trial, when you've had time and chances to listen to that evidence, to hear from those witnesses, to physically see the evidence in this case, and to hear it out of his own mouth, the state will ask you to find the defendant guilty of murdering Tara Grinstead on October 23rd of 2005. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hart.